When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably picture knights, castles, and plagues, not people getting high. But they did. Oh, they definitely did. From hallucinogenic herbs in monastery gardens to homemade brews that could knock out a horse, medieval people experimented with nature in ways that were equal parts spiritual, medical, and questionable. Whether it was to heal, to escape, or to touch the divine, they had their own ways of altering reality long before the word recreational existed. If you enjoy falling asleep to the stranger, more human side of history, a like or subscribe would be awesome. And tell me where you're listening from. It's wild seeing people from France to the Philippines all tuned into the same late-night story. All right, tonight, we're lifting the veil on a side of the Middle Ages you probably never heard about. Potions, herbs, and visions that blurred the line between medicine and magic. So, get comfortable, breathe deep, and let's explore what getting high was really like in medieval times and more.
It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim, mud-covered parade of monks, plagues, and potatoes. But under all that wool and despair, there were people, regular, flawed, experimental people, who occasionally looked at a strange root and thought, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with hot wine. And to be fair, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants, and the local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read or wondering how long your neighbour could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to modern assumptions, the concept of using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or simply make one's day slightly less horrible wasn't rare. It was baked right into the culture. But it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind the haystacks. It was wrapped in terms like visionary states, divine inspiration, pain relief, or in extreme cases, doctors used herbs, monks grew them. Witches, depending on who you asked, applied them, and almost everyone encountered these substances in some form through medicine, ritual, or accidental consumption of mouldy bread. Again, the range of medieval intoxicants wasn't limited to a tankard of warm ale, though that helped. They had roots that screamed, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that induced prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying naked through the sky with Satan's catering team. Getting high wasn't necessarily recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just very poor judgment on an empty stomach. And depending on your social rank, it might have been delivered by a barber, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who learned it from a very wise squirrel. In the medieval world, you didn't need a shady back alley or a velvet-roped club to get your hands on mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days, nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Medieval Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, let's say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying levels of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of Russian roulette. Properly prepared, it eased pain and brought on sleep. Improperly prepared, it introduced you to an entirely new set of problems, like convulsions and a strong desire to remove your own shoes while running through the woods screaming, or mandrake, the root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Legend said it screamed when pulled from the ground, a noise so lethal it could kill a man. That didn't stop people from digging it up anyway, usually by tying it to a dog and standing far away. Ingesting mandrake could induce unconsciousness, visions, and on a good day, prophetic dreams. On a bad day, well, you wouldn't be needing herbs anymore. Then there was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is exactly the kind of name that screams maybe not. It was used to dilate pupils for beauty, but also to treat pain, cause hallucinations, and on occasion death. Medieval self-care was a bold business. These herbs were often combined into teas, tinctures, oils, or those famous flying ointments we'll get to soon, and they weren't always consumed voluntarily. Sometimes they were applied during religious ceremonies, medical procedures, or by a well-meaning apothecary who thought a little extra root can't hurt, but hurt it could. Henbane, the medieval equivalent of let's see what this button does. Known to botanists as Hymusnesia, and to everyone else as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a staple of the Middle Ages' unofficial pharmacy. Used across Europe for centuries, henbane wasn't just a casual plant, it was a mood. Monks recorded its properties in herbals, physicians used it to dull pain, witches used it to ride broomsticks through their imaginations, and peasants mostly hoped not to eat it by accident. So, what exactly did henbane do? Well, that depends. In small doses it acted as a sedative. It could ease toothaches, help with insomnia, and make childbirth slightly less traumatic. In other words, it was the medieval version of take two and try not to scream. But in larger doses, or just poorly timed ones, henbane could cause delirium, hallucinations, wild agitation, and in some cases, a heartfelt conversation with a turnip you thought was your deceased grandmother. It contains scopolamine and hyoamine, which interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. To put it non-scientifically, your medieval brain gets weird fast. Visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and spontaneous outbursts of interpretive dance were all on the menu. Henbane was often smoked, brewed into teas, or even combined with fat, and smeared on the skin, a popular delivery method for anyone who didn't like their consciousness arranged in a linear fashion. Now, was it legal? Technically, yes. Controlled substances weren't a thing yet, but it was controversial, especially with the church. Anything that altered perception was suspicious. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, henbane had fans among healers, mystics, and people with nothing to lose. It even made its way into beer recipes before being banned in favour of safer additives like hops. Few plants in the medieval world were as feared, revered, and dramatically misunderstood as mandrake, a root so potent and weirdly human-shaped that it sparked a mix of botty, folklore, and sheer panic. Botanically known as Mandragora acinarum, the mandrake was associated with sleep, hallucinations, fertility, and a high probability of either mystical visions or waking up in a ditch next to a confused goat. Either way, something happened. Medieval herbalists believed that the root, which often resembled a stubby, contorted human figure, contained powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and according to some, a conduit to prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine to calm pain, or you could inhale its fumes and immediately question all your life decisions. But the real fame of the mandra came from its alleged habit of screaming when uprooted. Yes, screaming as in, "Don't pull me out of the dirt or you'll die from the noise," kind of screaming. Medieval texts warned that simply hearing the mandrakee's cry could kill a man, which naturally led to some creative harvesting techniques. The most famous involved tying the root to a dog, walking away, and letting the poor animal do the dirty work. The assumption was that the dog would die instead of you, a plan that raises some ethical red flags, even by medieval standards. Once harvested and the dog properly mourned, the mandra could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a charm. Some people even carried tiny mandra figures in pouches to ward off evil or promote fertility, because nothing says romance like a mummified root that sounds like it's seen things. The church predictably didn't love mandrakes. Anything that caused visions and wasn't tied to organised religion was treated as witchcraft adjacent. Still, monks recorded mandrake recipes in herbals with suspiciously detailed instructions. Used correctly, mandra could dull pain before surgery, treat insomnia, and create trippy, vivid dreams. Used incorrectly, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or your family staging an exorcism because you thought your soup was whispering. Let's say you were a medieval noblewoman hoping to attract attention at a feast. You could wear your best linen. You could braid flowers into your hair. Or if you were really serious, you could drip literal poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as atrapelladonna, or more honestly, deadly nightshade. The name alone sounds like a final boss in a medieval RPG, and yes, it was both alluring and lethal, the botanical equivalent of a seductive but unstable ex. The name belladonna means beautiful lady because when a few drops of its extract were added to the eyes, it dilated the pupils. Wide eyes were considered attractive, mysterious, and maybe even a little saintly. Of course, the downside was blurry vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended. But hey, beauty standards have never been particularly forgiving. Cosmetics aside, belladonna had other talents. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum, though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling is dripping Latin prayers. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which mess with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to "why is the wallpaper vibrating?" It was a common ingredient in potions, flying ointments, and some very questionable medical procedures. Want to numb a patient before sawing off a limb? Belladonna. Want to simulate a death-like sleep for theatrical or suspicious purposes? Belladonna. Want to accidentally meet a few saints and possibly the devil in your dreams? You get the idea. And yet, despite its toxicity, belladonna was part of the medieval medical toolkit. Physicians used it carefully or recklessly, depending on how bad the plague was that week. And it shows up in herbals, recipes, and love charms across Europe. Before modern edibles came in discreet packaging and fruity flavours, medieval folks were already getting inventive, just not with chocolate. Instead they relied on ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Welcome to the world of medieval transamal delivery systems, or in plain English, rubbing weird paste on your skin and hoping for the best. these concoctions weren't made for a casual weekend buzz. Many were tied to rituals, folk medicine, and spiritual experiences. They could knock you out, send you into ecstatic trances, or if misused, cause you to believe you were turning into a lizard. Application was often topical, which sounds safer until you learn the preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Yes, those membranes. Cue the infamous flying ointments associated with witches, a lovely blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna and pig fat, often applied to, let's just say, intimate areas. The goal, a euphoric sensation of flying. The result, either a transcendent astral journey or waking up in a haystack with half your teeth and no memory of how you got there. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in wine, broth, or some liquid that smelled like regret. Apothecaries loved mixing poppy extract with spiced wine. A combo strong enough to numb you during surgery or give you a front row seat to a divine revelation you didn't ask for. And let's not forget the elixir sold by wandering quacks. These travelling pharmacists promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague, often using recipes that could also dissolve a shoe. Did they work? Maybe. Or maybe they just made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The magic of these medieval edibles was that no one could quite predict the outcome. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or scream at the moon and swear eternal loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to find out. Let's talk about the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. It might seem quaint now, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes, but back then it came with an awkwardly scandalous backstory. Spoiler. The broomstick wasn't just for sweeping. The connection between witches and broomsticks actually has chemical roots. And no, not just mandrake. Historical records, especially those written by suspicious inquisitors, describe witches using flying ointments, thick trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and dura, all of which are about as friendly as a drunk porcupine. But here's the kicker. These ointments weren't taken by mouth. Why? Because the ingredients were toxic and stomachs are famously ungrateful. Instead, they were applied topically. And by topically, we mean mucous membranes. And by mucous membranes we mean, yes, exactly what you're thinking. Hence the broomstick, or as some sources delicately phrased it, a staff anointed for transportation. The handle was used as a vehicle for applying the ointment to areas with high absorption. Not exactly PG, but highly effective. Within minutes, users reported visions of flying through the night sky, attending feasts with the devil, or simply hovering above the village like the world's most confused drone. Of course, these were hallucinations, but in an age where medicine, magic and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one questioned it much. Inquisitors and theologians took note, of course, not because they were interested in pharmacology, but because they saw flying as evidence of consorting with demons, which is ironic considering the hallucinations were chemically induced and deeply unreliable. But when has medieval justice ever needed evidence? While medieval Europe was busy applying poison to broomsticks and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east in the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Enter hashish, the plant-based answer to existential dread and camel traffic. Derived from cannabis resin, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics, and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests field testing. Hashish was often consumed orally, usually mixed with honey, spices or other herbs, making it the first edible to actually taste good, as opposed to medieval Europe's tradition of bitter teas and things that smelled like spoiled socks. Its use wasn't just recreational, though yes, that absolutely happened. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners sought spiritual union with the divine. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation, or at the very least encourage long, thoughtful stares at walls. In fact, many Sufi poets and philosophers spoke of hashish, the way modern songwriters speak about bad breakups with intense emotion, abstract metaphors, and just enough fog to make you wonder if they were okay. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers tried to ban hashish use periodically, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or people giggling too much during prayer. But like most substance bans in history, this had roughly the same success rate as teaching a cat to juggle. The legendary Hashin, the original assassins, were even said to have used hashish before missions to get into the proper mindset for stabbing. That claim's mostly myth, but it's a great example of how cannabis-based products were already wrapped in both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, Europe was centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or calling it devil grass. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chanting, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense wafting through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't just about holiness, it also had a little something extra: psychoactive potential. Let's start with the two heavy hitters, frankincense and myrrh, both Rhenus substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, burned in churches, temples and royal courts. They were meant to cleanse the air, ward off evil spirits, and make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and fish stew. But here's the twist. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, particularly in sensyl acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sat in enough smoke, Gregorian chant wasn't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, which is to say all of them, prolonged exposure to incense could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially if paired with fasting, dehydration or extreme boredom. It wasn't uncommon for monks or devotees to report visions during long services. And while they often credited divine inspiration, it's possible some were just lightly buzzed from resin fumes. And if you think this was limited to Christian spaces, think again. Incense was a common fixture in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and even pre-Christian pagan rites. It transcended religion. Everyone loves a good vibe. Apparently clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality enough to make 5-hour sermons a bit more tolerable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lo-fi beats and lighting a scented candle, but with more Latin and less chill. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mee, wine, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house and calling it medicine. And in a way, it was. Water wasn't exactly safe to drink. Most natural sources were either contaminated or casually downstream from livestock, which meant sipping from a stream was basically playing intestinal roulette. So instead, people reach for something a little more fermented. Enter small beer, the medieval version of Lacqua, but with alcohol and a much higher chance of being brewed by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients by intuition and prayer. This low-alcohol drink was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a light buzz and regular hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier or simply had fewer plans for the day, you might opt for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. And yes, wine was often mixed with herbs or spices, either for flavour, medicinal effect, or just to see what happened. In monasteries, brewing beer was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste-tested the results, often with great enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were well ahead of the curve. But alcohol wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle enhancer. Want to dull the pain of medieval dentistry? Aye. Want to treat melancholy? Spiced wine? Want to forget you live in a drafty chvel with 6 other people and 1 extremely judgmental chicken? Mead, taverns, inns and roadside alehouses served as medieval therapy offices, only with more yelling. People drank to celebrate, mourn, gossip, and occasionally invent entirely new dance styles no one asked for. Sometimes getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a decision, it was just breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it looked like a slightly weird blackened kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval curse. Convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, and occasionally the sensation that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original LSD trip. Centuries before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything with tie-dye, people in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damp regions like France and the Germanic territories, frequently baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because hunger trumps fungus awareness. And so, entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves. And the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were 2 forms of erotism. Yes, it had a name. Convulsive erotism characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and fits of laughter or panic. Gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs blackening, shrivelling and falling off. Not ideal for dinner parties. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behaviour, including dancing plagues, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness. But in reality, it may have just been a mass case of unintentional mushroom toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, which ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat victims of erotism, often by feeding them wheat-based diets instead of rye. So, yes, the cure was different bread. Did people connect the dots? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or definitely possessed, and no one was testing for psychoactive alkaloids in their porridge. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Even today, some scholars believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials. Hallucinations, fits, paranoia, all very ergoty. But that's still debated. What's not debated? Medieval Europe got high on toast and didn't even know it. You've heard of magic mushrooms. You've heard of flying ointments. But have you ever heard of mad honey? Yes. In a few special corners of the medieval world, Even the bees were in on it. This wasn't your average grocery store honey, mind you. We're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers, pretty pink blooms with a dark secret. They're laced with granotoxins, naturally occurring compounds that don't play nicely with the human nervous system. The result, mad honey, a substance so potent it could bring on dizziness, hallucinations, vomiting, slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions, usually in that order. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. This wasn't just a local curiosity, it was weaponized. According to ancient and medieval sources, invading armies were once deliberately poisoned with mad honey left behind in abandoned villages. Soldiers thought they'd scored free snacks. Instead, they ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that Buke is not to be trusted. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strauss wrote about these effects centuries earlier, but the use persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle the stuff. A little on bread for a headache, a little in wine for visions, or none at all if you actually wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Mad honey became known as a remedy and a recreational substance, especially in mystical or folk healing traditions. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams, while others just woke up clutching a potato they believed was their uncle. Results varied, and yes, it was traded. Some ambitious merchants sold it in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions, because who needs warning labels when you live in an era where leeches are considered sophisticated medicine? Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a plague-ridden peasant. Some folks operated in the shadowy margins of society as shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, and other semi-legitimate practitioners of medicine and mischief. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss. These were the people you visited when the local physician suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no degrees, but they had herbal knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching Grandma treat boils with bark and dignity. And when it came to mind-altering substances, these folks were your go-to. They knew which plants to grind into paste, which roots to soak in wine, and how much of a given herb would make you dream of angels instead of accidentally join them. Whether you were looking to relieve pain, induce visions, curse your neighbour, or have an out-of-body experience during laundry, they had a remedy, or three. Many of these practitioners were women, midwives, wise women, and healers who were essential to their communities and deeply feared by authority figures. Not because they were cackling into cauldrons, but because they knew too much and didn't need Latin to explain it. Their remedies often included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy derivatives. They'd mix them with wine, fat, honey, or spit. Not kidding. Chant a few protective phrases and send you on your way with something that could either heal you or make you passionately confess to crimes you never committed. Of course, if anything went wrong, say a hallucination involving flying goats or the sudden urge to marry a tree, blame shifted quickly from bad batch to witchcraft. The church and local authorities kept one eye on these folk and the other eye nervously twitching. Still, communities relied on them. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, or when you needed to contact a dead relative to ask where they hid the rent money, these were the people you turned to. They weren't doctors, they weren't priests, they were the original underground wellness influencers. So, after all, the salves, brews, roots, ointments, incense, bees, and questionable bread. One big question remains. How did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer: conflicted. Deeply, hilariously conflicted. For some, especially healers and herbalists, mind-altering substances were a practical tool. If it dulled pain, slowed a fevered mind, or made childbirth 1% less horrifying, it was welcomed. This was medicine, not mischief. Sure, the patient might start reciting psalms backward, or insisting the cat was speaking French, but if the swelling went down, success. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, and those dabbling in divine communication. For them, hallucinations weren't red flags. They were revelations. Visions were signs of sanctity, not symptoms. If you stared into the void and the void whispered back in Latin, you were on the fast track to sainthood, or at the very least getting your own chapel mural. But intent mattered. Getting high by accident? Fine. Getting high to see Jesus? Acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon? Now we have a problem. That's where the church stepped in, branding certain substances and their users as suspicious at best, heretical at worst. Anything associated with a loss of control, be it intoxication, trance, or inconvenient honesty, raised clerical eyebrows. Saints could have visions, peasants probably just possessed. Meanwhile, among the common folk, opinions were more relaxed. Your neighbour's sleeping potion may have doubled as a psychedelic nightcap. People used poppy wine for pain, hashish for calm, and henbane tea for dealing with the in-laws. It wasn't seen as mystical or rebellious. It was just part of the medicine chest right next to the garlic and prayers. Ultimately, how the high was viewed came down to who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone tattled. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a weird grey area between miracle and misdemeanour, health and heresy. And in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all walked hand in hand, a little herbal escape now and then, hardly the worst idea. In the ancient world, the sea wasn't a void to be crossed. It was the beating heart of empire. It carried grain, gold, messages, soldiers, and sometimes war. Whoever commanded the seas didn't just own the water, they dictated the fate of entire civilizations. Unlike land warfare, where terrain shaped battles, naval warfare was about control, of flow, of trade, of communication, and of access. For seafaring empires like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, naval supremacy wasn't optional, it was existential. Without fleets, cities were vulnerable to isolation, starvation, and siege. With fleets, they could blockade enemies, protect merchant convoys, and even land forces deep behind enemy lines. Take the Mediterranean as an example. It wasn't called the Middle Sea for nothing. This inland ocean connected 3 continents and countless cultures. To dominate it meant having a finger on the pulse of everything from Phoenician trade routes to Roman grain shipments. The sea could bring wealth as swiftly as it could deliver disaster. That's why ancient powers poured resources into naval infrastructure, harbours, shipyards, dry docks, and naval mees. For Athens, the navy became its lifeblood. The mystical's vision of a triumph-powered military turned Athens into Atheloscracy, a sea-based empire. Its ships guarded grain routes from Egypt, levied tribute from allies, and crushed Persian ambitions at battles like Salamis. Carthage, on the other hand, emerged as a naval titan from merchant routes. Its dockyards were among the most advanced of the ancient world, producing warships on an almost industrial scale. Carthaginian dominance wasn't just about military power. It was backed by generations of sailors and navigators who understood the sea like a second skin. Egypt, with its strategic location at the mouth of the Nile and Red Sea, also relied heavily on fleets to protect trade with the Levant and Nubia. Although more riverine in orientation, Egyptian warships evolved into seafaring vessels capable of skirmishing with pirates and escorting treasure ships. In all these cases, naval warfare wasn't a sideshow, it was the main event. The sea was where rivals clashed, alliances were broken, and empires either flourished or floundered. Mastery of naval tactics, technology, and geography gave rise to legends, and when those fleets burned or sank, so too did the fortunes of the mighty. The Trium was not just a ship, it was a weapon. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it defined ancient naval warfare across the Mediterranean, and though many city-states built them, none wielded them quite like the Athenians. With 3 tiers of OES and a bronze-tipped ram, the tree was the ancient equivalent of a guided missile, one powered by sweat, rhythm, and strategy. A typical try measured about 120 feet long and just 18 feet wide. Narrow, yes, but that was the point. Its slim hull allowed it to slice through water with minimal drag, while its low draft let it operate close to shore for raids and landings. The name tree comes from its 3 rows of OES stacked vertically. These weren't random rowers either. Each was a trained seaman knowing how to move in unison, at speeds of up to 9 knots in battle. The Trium's most fearsome feature, the ram. A bronze-sheathed prow reinforced with oak, designed to smash into enemy hulls with devastating force. But ramming wasn't just about speed, it required precise timing and angle. Hit too straight and your own ship might get stuck or even capsize. Skilled captains like those in the Athenian navy perfected the art of the declus, a manoeuvre that involved slipping through enemy lines, turning quickly and striking exposed flanks. Above deck, the tree carried a small contingent of marines, usually around 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites and a few archers. Their role was to board enemy vessels or defend against boarding. But make no mistake, a try was not a floating fortress. It relied on agility, not armour. One wrong move and you were kindling. What made the Athenian tri-fleet truly revolutionary wasn't just the ship itself, it was the system behind it. Funded by the Theorica, a public naval fund, Athens built and maintained hundreds of triremes. Citizens, even the poorest, served as rowers, creating a strange kind of democracy at sea. When Athens beat the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BCE, it wasn't aristocrats who rode to victory. It was the common people. Ancient naval combat wasn't a cannon-blasting slugfest. It was more like high-speed chess with the occasional street brawl. The primary goal: disable or sink the enemy before they could do the same to you. And the main tool for that: ramming. Ramming was the centerpiece of naval tactics in the Tri-era. The goal was to pierce an enemy's hull below the waterline using the ship's bronze-tipped prow. A well-placed ram could send a vessel to the bottom in minutes, but it wasn't as simple as charge forward. Timing, angle, and coordination mattered immensely. Too sharp an approach and you'd glance off. Too direct and you might embed your ship in theirs, leaving both vessels vulnerable. To land a successful ram, fleets used complex manoeuvres like the Dakplow and Peripolis. In a D-class, a ship would dart through gaps in the enemy line, then pivot to strike from behind. The Peripolis involved circling around the enemy formation to hit exposed flanks. These weren't brute force tactics. They were precision strikes dependent on the rower's synchronization and the captain's foresight. But sometimes things didn't go to plan. Rams missed. Ships locked together. OS snapped. That's when Plan B came in. Boarding. Boarding turned the naval fight into a land-style melee. Once two ships collided or locked, Marines would leap aboard the enemy vessel with swords, spears and shields. These weren't delicate affairs. Boarding was brutal, close-quarters combat, more like a gang brawl than an orderly phalanx. Archers and slingers added chaos from the upper decks, picking off anyone who showed too much helmet. Some fleets, like those of the Romans, eventually favoured boarding over ramming. They even built special devices like the corvus, a boarding plank with a spike that could hook onto enemy ships and turn sea battles into floating land fights. This tactic helped Rome defeat more experienced Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War, because what Romans lacked in seamanship, they made up for in sheer infantry strength. Of course, this also meant naval battles became even bloodier and more chaotic. There was no retreat once boarding began. It was kill or be killed on a deck slick with salt water, blood, and broken timbers. If ramming was the scalpel of ancient naval warfare, then fire was its sledgehammer. There was no more terrifying sight than a flaming ship bearing down on your fleet. Fire ships were the naval world's version of controlled chaos, a weapon so dangerous that it often threatened the attacker as much as the enemy. Though not as common as triams or boarding actions, fire tactics emerged early and evolved over time. The basic principle was simple. Load a ship with flammable materials, pitch, tar, sulphur, resin, oil, and set it alight before sending it toward enemy vessels. Ideally, the fire ship would drift into tightly packed enemy lines, igniting sails, decks, and anything else unfortunate enough to be flammable. One of the earliest documented uses of fire ships comes from the Greco-Persian conflicts, where desperate defenders tried to repel naval invasions by hurling flaming rafts or boats toward enemy galleys. In the confined spaces of a harbour, or strait where manoeuvrability was limited, a single fire ship could cause mass panic and break formations. But fire at sea was a double-edged sword. Winds could shift, flames could backfire. A poorly timed fire ship could destroy your own fleet as easily as the enemy's. This is why fire was often reserved for desperate moments, blockades, surprise attacks, or last stands where the risk was worth the havoc. The most sophisticated development in ancient incendiary warfare came with Greek fire, a mysterious and fearsome weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire centuries later, but inspired by ancient fire tactics. Greek fire could allegedly burn on water and couldn't be extinguished with standard methods. While it's more medieval than ancient, its conceptual roots, chemical fire used in naval dominance, can be traced back to these early fire ships. Egyptian and Phoenician fleets also used variations of fire-based weapons, particularly against pirate vessels and during sieges. For instance, coastal defenders might catapult firepots or flaming arrows onto ships attempting to breach harbours. The psychological effect of fire at sea was unmatched. A ram could be blocked, a boarder could be repelled, but fire panicked crews devoured wooden hulls and spread faster than orders could be shouted. Even the most experienced sailors might abandon ship at the first whiff of pitch and smoke. In the 5th century BCE, Athens transformed itself from a landlocked city-state into a dominant naval superpower. And it all started with silver. When a massive silver vein was discovered in the mines of Laura Mysticals, an ambitious Athenian politician convinced his fellow citizens not to divide the wealth, but to invest it. His plan: build a fleet of triams, lots of them. That decision changed history. With over 200 warships at its peak, the Athenian navy became the backbone of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's power was no longer rooted in hoplite infantry or stone walls. It sailed on wood, sweat, and strategy. The victory at Salamis in 480 BCE, where theistically fleet trapped and annihilated the Persian navy in narrow straits, is still one of the most decisive sea battles of the ancient world. That win didn't just save Athens, it positioned it as the protector and soon ruler of the Iron. Under the Dian League, Athens began extracting tribute from allied city-states, supposedly for mutual naval defence. In practice, this tribute was often used to fund Athens' own interests, from shipbuilding to public architecture. The navy allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project its power far beyond its borders. But it wasn't just about military might. The fleet democratized Athens. The poorest citizens who couldn't afford armour or land to fight as hoplites became essential rowers in the triremes. Their contribution gave them political clout, transforming the Athenian assembly and empowering the lower classes. Sea power became people power. However, this dominance came at a price.